Okay, so I would like to present my report conducted under the supervision of Olga Mykolaievna Nikolenko. And my report is based on the synthesis of two arts. And this is not a coincidence because I will tell about French Impressionism and the art of Japanese engraving ukiyo-e on the novel The Picture of Dorian Gray. While Impressionism itself is a movement in art which started in French painting in the 1870s and 1880s, and it had the big influence on literature. It started with the picture of Claude Monet, Impressionism Sunrise. It is their second picture in the top right corner on the slide. The Impressionism, the artists of Impressionism, they discovered a new artistic vision. They pictured not the reality, but their own subjective impression. So this means that they painted not the reality, but their emotions and feelings. And they also discovered the beauty of everyday world and the simple things of nature. Among the European writers of 18th and 20th centuries who followed the trends and tendencies of Impressionism were Guy de Maupassant, Stéphane Mallarmé, Boris Pasternak, and many others. And here, one of the most important role is of Oscar Wilde, because his works were like bridges between traditional art and modernism. In the end of the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century. In the second half of the 19th century in Europe, there was a great influence of Japanese art because of the great interest in it. For example, in 1856, the French artist and collector Félix Bricmont first discovered the beauty of Japanese engravings, and he studied the art of engraving, imitating Japanese masters. However, the Europe's acquaintance with Japanese culture had some complications and some problems because Japan's ports were closed for foreigners, and the only port to connect Europe and Japan was Nagasaki. However, by the mid-70s, the real Japanese fever had spread to France and other European countries, because merchants brought household items and art from Japan. Then in 1883, Louis Gons organized an exhibition in Paris, which presented works of Japanese arts, and they were especially inspired by Japanese engravings ukiyo-e. So here, ukiyo-e, when did it start, who worked in this style, and what are the main concepts here? Well, this is the art and the movement that started in the 17th century and was developing during the 18th and 19th century. And the main concepts here were to catch something fleeting, impermanent, something contemporary and momentous. They depicted ordinary world, and ordinary people inscribed their native inhabitants. They thought that beauty is asymmetrical and incorrect in terms of proportions. And also they fascinated the uniqueness of nature. And the famous artists who worked in this style were Hishigawa Morinobu, Hishigawa Tsukinobu, and Okumura Masanobu. And at this time, the young writer, young novelist got a scholarship at Oxford College of St. Magdalene, and he listened to lectures by honored professor of art, John Ruskin. The professor had big influence on Oscar Wilde, and the writer accepted his ideas about the priority of art and nature in life. And these ideas can be found in his novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, because this novel opens the feeling of a young man when the artist Basil Hallward paints a beautiful portrait of Dorian Gray, and when young Dorian sees the portrait, he is depressed because his beauty will disappear when he grows old. And in the moment of deep despair, he wishes to stay young and beautiful forever, and he will. The portrait takes all the negative and grows ugly, disgusting, and old, while Dorian is still beautifully charming. And this magic changed a young man. By the way, Oscar Wilde was not only a collector, but also a popularizer of Japanese engravings and Japanese culture in England. Therefore, in the novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, you may find a lot of Japanese motifs. Already in the first section of the novel, there is a detailed and poetic description of spring nature. The shadows of birds formed for a moment something similar to the Japanese pattern. Also, the influence of visual art on the novel is in the detailed description of the room and the surrounding of the heroes. From the corner of the divan of Persian saddlebags, on which he was lying, smoking, as was his custom, innumerable cigarettes, Lord Henry Wotton could just catch the gleam of the honey-sweet and honey-colored blossoms of laburnum, whose tremulous branches seemed hardly able to bear the burden of a beauty so flame-like as theirs. And now and then, the fantastic shadows of birds in flight flittered across the long tortoise silk curtains that were stretched in front of the huge window, producing a kind of Japanese effect and making him think of that pale jet-faced painters of Tokyo who, through the medium of art that is necessarily immobile, seek to convey the sense of swiftness and motion. Also, Basil Hallward, the artist, and Lord Henry Wotton talk about art sitting on the bamboo bench, and this kind of furniture was especially popular in Europe in the late 19th century. Because there was a big interest in Oriental culture, Japanese and Chinese in particular. So benches, tables, dishes, and tea sets came into usage. For example, in the novel, the two young men went out in the garden together and encased themselves on a long bamboo seat that stood in the shade of a tall laurel bush. And one more quote. There came a knock at the door, and the butler entered with a leaden tea tray and set it down upon a small Japanese table. There was a rattle of cups and saucers, and the hissing of a fluttered Georgian urn. Two globe-shaped china dishes were brought in by a page. On this slide, you may see a picture of discussion between Basil Hallward and Dorian Gray, and it shows the development of artist's idea, because at first Basil wanted to portray Dorian Gray as in the form of Paris in luxurious armor, or Adonis, so Japanese Greek gods, but it is different from life. So Basil decides to paint Dorian Gray in his usual everyday costume and suit, and so in his usual appearance. So that's the conflict between traditional ideal art and the reality here. So that's the bridge that Oscar Wilde provides for us. One day, a fatal day, I sometimes think I determined to paint a wonderful portrait of you as you actually are, not in the costume of dead ages, but in your own dress and in your own time. And this proves that Oscar Wilde was following the trends and tendencies of Impressionism, because he claims that the painter actually unfolds and uncovers his own feelings and emotions, because every portrait that is painted with the feeling is a portrait of the artist, not of a sitter. So not the model is in the picture, but the artist himself. An important role in the novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, is played by art exhibitions that heroes talk about. For example, in chapter 1, Lord Henry persuades Basil to exhibit his works at the Grosvenor Gallery. It's your best work, Basil. The best thing you've ever done. You must certainly send it next year to the Grosvenor. The Academy is too large and too vulgar. Whenever I have gone there, there have been either so many people that I haven't been able to see the pictures, which was dreadful, or so many pictures that I haven't been able to see the people, which was worse. The Grosvenor is really the only place. The Grosvenor Gallery was founded in 1877 in London by Sir Cutts Lindsay and his wife Blanche. At the end of the 18th century, they provided halls not only to the famous and distinguished painters, but also for those who work in non-academic style. And John Ruskin and Oscar Wilde, they visited that gallery quite often. Another mentioning of the gallery is the gallery and exhibition by George Petit. Basil Hallward came to the house of Dorian Gray, and he wants to take the portrait to exhibit it at their hall at the gallery of George Petit. George Petit is going to collect all my best pictures for a special exhibition in the Rue d'Assas, which will open the first week in October. The portrait will only be away for a month. I should think you could easily spare it for that time. So George Petit was a well-known French businessman and collector at that time. He held luxurious large-scale exhibition, and his gallery was located in Paris on Rue d'Assas in a fashionable house, number 8. And many impressionists were exhibited there, among them Claude Monet, Auguste Renoir, Edouard Manet, and many others. So the mentioning of these two galleries proves that Basil Hallward painted the portrait of Dorian Gray in a new style. So that was Impressionist portrait, probably, because probably that was Impressionism. And by the way, Basil Hallward later planned to go to Paris for 6 months, and Paris was the center of the new art and new movement at that time. But the crime of Dorian Gray stopped this intention and prevented Basil from fulfillment of his plans, because he was murdered by Dorian Gray. So here it's needed to mention the goal of French Impressionists, as well as Japanese masters of engraving, ukiyo-e, was to show the dynamic of the picture, so catch and show the moment, to experiment with different colors and different shapes, to make the portrait show the feelings of the author. So this dynamic landscape is also in the novel. For example, the wind shook some blossoms from the trees, and the heavy lilac blooms with their clustering stars moved to and fro in the languid air. A grasshopper began to chirrup by the wall, and like a blue thread, a long thin dragonfly floated past on its brown gauze wings. So the trends of Impressionism and ukiyo-e that are in the novel, the picture of Dorian Gray, are the following. First, dynamic landscapes, then an intention to catch and show a moment, attention to feelings and emotions, changing colors and shapes, and the principle that art and nature is above all. So thank you for your attention to my presentation.